The college football playoff projections have just been released, and it seems as though the most controversial decision that the committee has made is allowing for a 3-loss Alabama team to be projected into the playoffs. And if you want to shout that that's some SEC favoritism, I wouldn't blame you. I'd argue that there are several more teams more deserving of a playoff spot than Alabama. And if we were to take a look at some of Alabama's losses this season, well, 2 of them come against very mediocre SEC schools. I'm sorry, but if you have a conference record of 5-3, there is no way you should be in the college football playoffs. You simply aren't one of the best 12 teams in the country. Hell, I'd argue that you're in the bottom half of your conference. I don't care that the SEC is supposed to be stacked. Alabama went 5-3 in that conference, and it wasn't because the competition was great, but rather because Alabama is just mediocre. It is a fact that they lost several key players to the transfer portal once they found out that Nick Saban was retiring. So of course Alabama is going to drop off not only in talent, but in skill. And we've seen that, which is why Alabama ended up going 9-3 in the regular season. Hell, they're not even in the SEC championship game. Talk about a fall from grace for Alabama. Now, the only valid argument I've heard in Alabama's favor is that the reason they are ranked number 11 and so high is because of their strength of schedule. Right now, Alabama's strength of schedule sits 17th strongest in the country. But if Alabama really cared about having such a strong schedule, they wouldn't have put Western Kentucky, South Florida, and Wisconsin on it. In fact, out of the 16 SEC schools, Alabama's schedule ranks 10th toughest, with schools like Florida, Vanderbilt, Kentucky, and Mississippi State all having much harder schedules than the one that Alabama had to go up against. And the fact that Alabama lost 3 games is very telling. I don't think that the committee should be putting as much of an importance on strength of schedule rather than the strength of losses, because Alabama's losses when compared to Miami's, well, they aren't the same, because Miami's losses have been against much more difficult teams. I know that the ACC isn't as strong of a conference, but still, when Alabama is going out and losing to schools like Oklahoma, who is having a really bad year, or Vanderbilt, who is notoriously one of the worst schools in SEC history, or even Tennessee, who is supposed to be on par with Alabama, well, it just shows you how Alabama has fallen. And before I take a deep dive into each of Alabama's losses on the season, what I want to do is remind you guys to slow down, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. We're on the road to 5,000 subscribers, and I would do anything if you subscribe. Alright, now let's get to Alabama's first loss against Vanderbilt. Heading into this game, Alabama was undefeated. They were 4-0, they were the number 1 ranked team in the country, and they had just dethroned number 2 seeded Georgia Bulldogs. They looked unstoppable, and this game against Vanderbilt was essentially a bye week for Alabama. But of course, we all know how things shook up in Nashville, and the main reason that Vanderbilt was able to win this game was because they controlled possession. They did a great job of keeping Alabama's explosive offense away from the ball. And it always helps when you start the game with a 10-play drive that chews up more than 6 minutes and ends with a Cedric Alexander 7-yard rushing touchdown. And it also helps that right after that extremely long drive for Vanderbilt, they end up getting a pick 6 off of Jalen Milroe. Essentially, less than a minute of game time later, Jalen Milroe is out here throwing costly interceptions. And that gave Vanderbilt a 13-0 lead, a lead in which they wouldn't give up for the rest of the game. And that's the part that I found most impressive about this Vanderbilt win, was the fact that Vanderbilt maintained the lead the entire time. And it's not like Alabama's offense didn't figure things out eventually. I mean, Alabama would go on to score 35 points. But the thing about Vanderbilt is that they answered back every single time. Let's take a jump here to the third quarter, where Vanderbilt was leading 23-21. And what ends up happening here is Diego Pavia explodes. He throws a 36-yard bomb to Junior Sherrill to give Vandy a bigger lead. And that extension of a lead was exactly what they needed at the time. And he does the same thing in the fourth quarter, because in the fourth quarter, Vanderbilt finds themselves only leading by 5. Again, the lead shrinks. And what does Diego Pavia do? Drives his team down the field in 7 plays in 4 minutes. He's chewing up a lot of clock every time he does this, and ends up throwing a 6-yard pass to Johnson, which gives Vanderbilt a 40-28 lead, and 40 points was thankfully enough for Vanderbilt to win this game. And it all looked like all was lost for Alabama. I mean, Alabama, for them to lose against Vanderbilt, I know that it was Kalen Deboer's first year as a head coach, but still, this was a huge loss to the program. And then a few weeks later, they go out and do it again. They lose, this time to Tennessee. You see, Alabama came into the game 5-1. They were the 7th seed, and Tennessee was a little better than what Vanderbilt was because Tennessee came into that game as the 11th seed. And what happens is that Jalen Milroe struggles again. Who could have guessed it? I mean, Jalen Milroe has been struggling all season long, so to see him struggle in their losses makes sense. Now, Alabama's offense, while they did figure things out in the Vanderbilt game, the same can't be said for the game against Tennessee. Sure, they started off the game with a 5-yard touchdown to Ryan Williams after an 8-play drive that chewed up 3 minutes and 50 seconds, and that was great for Alabama. But they didn't really do a whole lot of scoring after that. In fact, it was mostly Tennessee, because in the third quarter, Tennessee would go out and get 2 touchdowns of their own. And both of these touchdowns were off the back of running back Dylan Sampson, who really chewed up this Alabama defense. He ended up rushing for 139 yards on 26 carries, and his 2 touchdowns both came in the third quarter. And after those 2 touchdowns, well, Tennessee wasn't done scoring because in the fourth quarter, when Tennessee was down 17-14, they go out and they drive 7 plays down the field, 54 yards, and it ends with a Chris Brazil 16-yard pass from Nico, and that was enough to give Tennessee a lead in which they would later go on to extend and end up beating Alabama 17-24. And after this loss, it felt like, okay, Kalen Deboer has got to get his boys under control. They already have 2 losses in the SEC. They can't afford to lose another one. Of course, we know that's not true because apparently Alabama could afford to lose 3 games in conference this season and still miss the playoffs. But enough about that. Let's get to the game against Oklahoma, which was their most recent loss. And unlike the other 2, this game was not competitive at all because Alabama ended up scoring 3 points. They didn't put up a single touchdown against Oklahoma. And Oklahoma is not a good team. I mean, their defense is astounding. In fact, their defense is one of the best in the country. The only reason Oklahoma is so ass this year is because their offense is trash. But apparently their offense can step it up when they get a big game against Alabama, and that's exactly what happened here. Because in this game against Alabama, Oklahoma ended up scoring 24 points. And for the most part, Oklahoma's scoring was pretty spread out. In fact, they wouldn't get points on the board until the second quarter, and that was a field goal to tie the game 3-3. But of course, right before halftime, Oklahoma finally gets things going, and they end their drive with an 18-yard run by Xavier Robinson to give Oklahoma a 10-3 lead. And that was exactly the kind of energy that this Oklahoma offense needed because they, as well as Alabama's offense, were struggling for the entire first half. In fact, it was a pretty boring game. But Oklahoma realized that, okay, a lot of people's eyes are going to be on this game. Let's show out. And that's what they did in the third quarter because at the beginning of the third quarter, they had the ball for about 2 minutes, and in 5 plays were able to score. And thankfully, it was Xavier Robinson again, another 1-yard rush into the end zone. And they wouldn't stop their scoring, especially in the third quarter. They would get another touchdown, and this touchdown came because of Jalen Milroe making mistakes. Jalen Milroe would go out and throw another pick 6, and that was only 3 minutes after Oklahoma had just scored. This time, this one was for 49 yards to give Oklahoma a 24-3 lead. As I said earlier, when Jalen Milroe struggles, the entire team struggles, and it's not like Alabama has one of those defenses that can score for them, especially not against good schools. And those were all 3 of the losses that Alabama has suffered this season. And now that we've taken an even closer look into each of Alabama's losses this season, I hope you can understand why Alabama doesn't deserve to be in the college football playoffs. I mean, let's look at Jalen Milroe's numbers this season. It's his junior year. You expect that this is going to be his final year before heading into the NFL draft, but who knows now? Jalen Milroe might just come back for his senior season to kind of boost his draft stock, especially because NIL money is through the charts, so he might even get paid more just by staying an extra year in college. And if he does stay, it's not going to be guaranteed to be with Alabama. So maybe we'll see Jalen Milroe in the transfer portal. Who knows? His future is still up in the air. He can still make a run in the playoffs if Alabama stays there. But this season, Jalen Milroe's passing stats have seen a bit of a decline. While his completion percentage did stay around 65.9%, his passing yards and passing touchdowns are down from a year ago. You see, in 12 games so far, Jalen Milroe has gone out and thrown for 2,652 passing yards, along with 15 passing touchdowns. Just a year ago, Jalen Milroe finished the season with 23 passing touchdowns. And the one number that has gone up for Jalen Milroe in the air are the number of interceptions. In his first 2 full seasons as a starter for Alabama, Jalen Milroe threw a total of 9 interceptions. This year alone, Jalen Milroe has already thrown 10. And if they get into the college football playoffs, we can definitely see that number rise. And that's not even mentioning the fact that we've already seen the interceptions that Jalen Milroe's thrown cost the team games. Now, the one area that Jalen Milroe has improved in is the ground game, so I will give him that. You see, he's rushed for over 150 attempts, and out of those 150 attempts, he's been able to get 719 rushing yards, along with an extra 20 TDs, which does add to his number. But Jalen Milroe was supposed to be a Heisman candidate, and that just isn't the way that his season has played out. And his bad play has affected this team. And that's all to say that I don't think Alabama should be in this 12-team format. And they might not be, depending on how the ACC championship plays out. But that's a conversation for another day. Anyway, I think I've said everything I wanted to in this video, so I'll catch y'all later. Much love. Deuces.